My name is Charles Meek. I'm a figurative artist working and living in London. My current subject matter is sensitive because it's about human confrontation and conflict. It's not an easy subject for me to deal with, but it comes simply from the fact that there is so much conflict in the world at the moment. I've seen conflict throughout my life in various parts of the world, and after a while you begin to wonder whether we are inevitably destined to fight each other. And as an artist, I want to address that question, and I search in my art for a way of addressing conflict as a subject in a way in which I hope will influence at least the way in which people view conflict, human wars, the conflicts that are going on, not just in the Middle East and in Ukraine, but around the world at the moment. I think what led me to it was actually an overwhelming sense of revulsion at some of the images we were confronted with on a daily basis in our newspapers, on our television screens, and the damage and the suffering that the fighting causes everywhere. And then when you examine why the fights start, you simply feel that some form of diplomatic effort could have been made, should have been made, that would have prevented the fighting starting. And when you look at the level of diplomacy that is deployed to try and stop the fighting, it always seems or feels to me wholly inadequate when put beside the level of suffering that we see on our screens every day. And so a lot of my work actually is about the human tendency to confront each other and be aggressive towards each other, which then leads inevitably to some form of conflict, and the inadequacy of the international diplomacy to bring the fighting to an end. So because my current practice is about human conflict, my work presents human figures, either in a state of confrontation or in some form of narrative, which to me is relevant to the way in which I as an artist am trying to confront and address this topic. And it's not an easy thing for me to do, mainly because artists throughout history have addressed human conflict and done that in very, very different ways, either in some respects glorifying military achievements and endeavors, or actually at the other end of the spectrum, presenting truly graphic, deeply distressing images of war and conflict. If those have failed to stop us fighting, which they clearly have, I suppose the challenge for me as an artist is whether or not it's possible to find some other way of addressing human conflict, which might actually have some influence on the way in which we view conflict and perhaps help us to suppress some of it. The work I've been doing recently, I suppose, falls into two parts. Some of it is just very simple representations of graphic images of confrontation between two individuals, simply to display images of confrontation so that I present that as a backdrop to what then becomes violent conflict. But the most recent work I've produced is a narrative work taken from an incident mentioned in Plato's Republic, where a man called Leontius wants to look at some dead bodies in front of a public executioner. And wanting to do that starts a turmoil in his mind, because on the one hand he wants to look at the bodies, on the other hand he's disgusted with himself for wanting to do that. He loses the battle and stares at these dead bodies, but then curses his eyes for wanting to do that. And the image I have painted represents that narrative. And that was an important work for me, because I think there is something in us which is drawn to images of suffering, distress, conflict. We see them every day on the front of our newspapers. We watch them on television as part of newsreel. But more than that, we watch violent films, and violence seems to be almost an integrated part of our existence at the moment. And I want to question why that is. I want to understand why, as a species, we appear to be drawn to images of violence. I find that upsetting. So the work I was talking about a moment ago is called Leontius, because that is the name of the man in Plato's Republic who looks at the dead bodies outside the walls of Athens. But that work follows on from a previous ceramic series that I made. They were porcelain vases, which I decorated with a process called applying decals to the porcelain and then firing the porcelain with those images on them. The images were taken from magazines which I read as a boy at school in the 1960s. I bought some of those magazines and I took images from them and applied them to these ceramic pieces. And those images were jingoistic, they were colourful, jingoistic images of Second World War acts of soldierly heroism. And we read them as boys when I was a child. They were a staple diet for us of reading. And I produced the work because decades later, I question whether that diet of violent cartoon imagery in some way conditions us to accept violence as normal in our lives, and even actually, when dealing with acts of heroism, as something to be aspired to. But when you set those images beside the real images of suffering and hurt that we see in the fighting that's going on at the moment, the jarring discrepancy between the two is striking. And I suppose in those ceramic pieces, I'm exploring a deep discomfort that I've got about my personal background, reading those stories, and setting that history against what I find so upsetting now, which is images of people dying and being wounded in current conflicts. I don't feel that I have exhausted that topic yet, but I do think that there's a limit to how long I want to go on addressing that subject. I'm not sure I will ever leave it completely, but I think of myself as, with a very small p, a political artist, or an artist with an activist sense behind me. There are some enormous topics around at the moment. There's obviously climate change. There is artificial intelligence and the impact that's going to have on us as a species. I don't want to sound too pessimistic about everything, but I am pessimistic about artificial intelligence, and one day, quite soon, I will produce work about that subject, I hope.